Okay, this is Melanie from Miracles in Wonder. It is first thing in the morning and it's rainy and beautiful in our backyard. There's a plane about to go over Tuga, and I'm just going to take you through some of the ideas that the cosmology is not so much based in, but where my questions led me as far as what I looked at. So the things in the world and the way that I ask questions allowed me to build a picture of the universe. So the cosmology itself, Heart Alchemy, is how I operate in the world. It is something that has been with me since I was born, probably before. It's something that directs all of my questions. So this process of just running through how I interacted with reality and what questions I asked and how that helped me build a picture is not so much about the ideas that you need to have in place in order for the cosmology to operate. It's more a sense of how my focus, the questions that I asked, what I paid attention to, built a picture of what made sense to me from the cosmology. That distinction might not make a lot of sense in the beginning, and that's fine. If this is just a story that keeps you entertained for a bit, that's fantastic. And there is a lot of fascinating things in the world, and I think it is about that sense of how to follow your fascination. So when you come upon something that doesn't make sense, there is an innate part of you when you're in the cosmology, when you're practicing heart alchemy, when it is your natural state, there is a natural fascination with what you don't understand and how to put yourself in a position where understanding is possible. And somewhere that's where that effortlessness comes in. I mean, it is because the sense of fascination is not just about what you don't understand that you can't see. It's not about just other people or a maths question. It is also about your experience and your sense of identity and how all of that is inseparable. Like there's no sense of inside, outside. It's all the same fascination. So as a kid, my dad will probably tell you I was the but why child, constantly asking, but why? And it wasn't so much that I wanted to know the why as we understand now. I wanted to understand how it all fits together, because somehow my asking why led to more questions. You know, if I asked how, there was a sense of an end story. You know, and that sense of, if you ask a question, why is the sky blue, there are still a lot of people that have different answers for that. So I think the fact that I asked why is even indicative of that sense of, well, I knew that there was more information. Somewhere I knew that I was looking for a particular feeling in the answer that I got. It wasn't so much about the data. There is a sense of the truth is self-evident in the experience that you have when that information is revealed. So, why? Now, that was my family and school was amazing. I was really thirsty and there was lots of information available, and they entertained my curiosity. So I was encouraged to find out more things. You know, there were libraries available, and I read lots of things and asked lots of questions, and I was completely fascinated. And then I came upon the Bosnian War, and I was in my early teens, And I guess I had never really understood poverty. We didn't watch a lot of TV, so I didn't see a lot of those ads of starving kids and things like that. So I wasn't exposed to a lot of the stories about the world that a lot of children today are being exposed to. A sense of overwhelming awareness of the experiences of suffering across the planet. I wasn't exposed to that. I didn't have media contact. It wasn't part of my life, and I certainly didn't have contact with other children and their sense of media. So the first situation that I came upon that didn't make sense, that I had to research for myself, was the Bosnian War. And as soon as I came upon it, I wanted to understand more than the newspaper or our independent media could tell me, because they were only going so far. I wanted to understand all of the information around what was happening. It wasn't just so much about what does this faction believe and what does that faction believe. I wanted to understand, well, where did those beliefs come from? What was the story behind the whole conflict? And when you begin to look into all of those stories, you realize that it never ends. And it's not just a linear moving backwards, never ends. That story is interwoven into the fabric of reality, of everyone's experience of what they believe is right and wrong, how they believe they have been harmed. The people who are fighting for justice and what they believe will manifest that justice, and who they perpetrate that justice against, and the people who are the subjects of that justice, and what their story is, and what they're fighting for, and what they believe is happening, and what everybody's interests come back to, and so the story about this one is in economics, and the story of this one is in linear heritage and honor, and a sense of speaking for people who have been silenced. Like, there's no way to avoid the fact that there's this interwoven story of realities, and they're all, when I say stories, it might sound like I'm saying they're not true. They're all true. The point is that they're all true. There is a sense that these people's experience is inseparable from their story. So there's no way to investigate any of these things from Heart Alchemy and not get to the point where you understand that all of these stories mean something, and all of these stories are inseparable from the experience that these people are having. So no matter how much information you get about the war and both sides and how you could bring them together, there is a sense that there's no objective facts that you could bring to both parties that they could agree on, because there is so much personal experience involved in the story. And when you get into the cosmology of Heart Alchemy, we take you into where those stories originate for you and how they're operating in the world. Not as something that's wrong, as a sense of perfection about how wise they are. But I think, before we get to that point, that sense of how the story and the experience are interwoven, brings you to a sense of, well, what is experience? If that's true, if there's no way to separate out something that everybody can agree upon, which seems to be happening in the world, in all kinds of fields, whether you're in the education department or whether you're in international relations, or, you're looking at sustainability, or even how to raise a child, the story about what is the right thing to do. That sense of it's that experience, that story of each person who's in that place saying, here are the 5 people and the 5 stories about what is best. It's impossible to separate out the stories that they have about what is best from their experience, from who they are, from the beliefs and rules that have been set in place. So, I decided at that point, in my mid-teens, to study sense perception. I wanted to understand how we take in information. If the story is inseparable from the experience, then I want to understand what the experience is. And if the experience is mediated by our senses, then I want to understand how that works. And the more I investigated that process, the more I found that it's inseparable from cognition and memory. It's inseparable from all of the functions of your biology. So how you take in information is going to also be dependent upon the brain state, and the brain state is dependent upon the chemical state, and the chemical state is dependent on the ideology. And look, the more and more and more that you ask these questions and investigate what's relevant, you find out that everything is relevant. There's no way to understand reality without your personal bias. And this idea is not new. There are lots of studies and scientific data. If you need that kind of information, it's readily available about how reality is created through the bias of our experience. I don't think this is a new concept. I think where this concept gets taken within our Heart Alchemy is very different to where it gets taken in other cosmologies. So if we can't know reality outside of our bias, then how can we know it? Like there is a sense of if we get to a point where we realise that that looks like a dead end, actually it's an opportunity to ask another question. There is a sense of some other way of understanding our experience of reality. So how can we understand it without bias? What do we need to do? And if that's not possible, then what is possible? So I started to study physics, which is the science of matter, and I wanted to understand how the universe was fit together. If we couldn't understand it in an experience that wasn't biased, how did physics work? How did we measure things that we can't experience without a filter? And that fascinated me, because then I realised that consciousness and the study of matter and what is called cosmology is inseparable. And again, we get to this point where everything is interwoven. There's no way to understand our study of matter, let alone matter itself. There's no way to understand our study of matter outside of consciousness. And so we study consciousness, which is, all manner of things. There is, philosophy and neurobiology and chemistry. There's an array of sciences, and I find them all fascinating because they all speak to the questions that we ask. They all speak to the data that we look for when we ask those questions, which is even, for me, more fascinating than the conclusions that people come up with. They're more fascinating than the revelations of the data because it speaks to what we're looking for. And even in that sense of separating the brain from the body, from the animating force, from the soul or spirit, whatever you understand that as, and taking that for granted in the studies, in the spiritual texts, in all of these, places that we seek some philosophical or scientific understanding, some fixed point to put ourselves, because that's really what we're looking for. We're looking for some fixed point to put ourselves so that we can say, this is the truth, and everywhere that I look from this point will make sense to me, and if it doesn't make sense to you, then you're not on this point. And what I found was there's no direct perception. It's impossible. Even looking at physics and consciousness and the interrelation of all of those things, spirituality and philosophy, there's no direct perception of reality. How can you accept that? Where do you go? What question do you ask? What comes up for you when that becomes a reality? I think that's a big question. That sense of, does that mean there is no objective reality, or does it just mean that your experience of it is subjective? Fabulous question. And then it brings into the discussion, well, what about the things that we think we do know, or we can experience? What about pain? We know that's real. We know that we can measure it in the nerve endings in the brain, and and it's alleviated by particular chemicals and blah blah blah. And yet it's not. Pain is still a subjective experience. You can go to a kinesiologist and they can push a point on your body and you won't feel that pain at all. The pain is not about the nerve endings and the brain and the chemical messages. There's something else going on. And even that sense of why some people, what they call, have a higher threshold or a lower threshold, which is just to say they experience more pain than someone else. And what about those situations where they can, through MRI, see that pain is being experienced, but there is no cause in the body. There is no way to measure what's happening. There's a lot going on when you start to look at what is the truth of our experience. I mean, even in that sense of psychological pain, that's very real. The pain of loss, the pain of distress, the pain of confusion, the pain of abandonment, the pain of hunger, there are many ways of understanding what pain is. to meet that experience and say, this is my invitation to make noise. This is my punishment for not eating well. This is my indication to seek professional assistance. There are 3 different stories you can tell about the experience that you're having. And they will change the chemicals in your body. They will change the way your nerves respond. They will change the way your brain communicates what the experience that you're having is. And it's not to say that any of those 3 stories are more true or that you should take on one rather than the others. It's just to point out that even in pain, something that we take for granted as objective, something that we take for granted as, well, it means X, Y, Z, there's a lot more going on. And there are other experiences which are even more incredible. Like when we get sick. Now, there is an amazing study. There was a group of people that had chronic knee problems. And they took some of the people in that group and they went and gave them knee reconstructions. And they took another part of that group and they gave them incisions on their body that looked like they'd had the same operation, but they didn't actually do anything inside. But they told them that they'd had a knee reconstruction. Now, the people that had the knee reconstruction, that the surgeons actually went in and fiddled around, didn't recover as well, experienced more pain, and had more issues with the surgery than the people who only had the incisions and no surgery. So the people who didn't have the surgery recovered faster and the results lasted longer. So they didn't have, as far as the study goes, whatever it was, 5 years later or whatever, they didn't have any issues. They recovered perfectly. The inside of the body repaired itself. When they took scans of it, without having the surgery, the knee reconstruction took place without the surgeons having to do anything. Now, I know the idea of the placebo is quite popular and that it's presented as mind over matter. And I think one of the things that this study and other studies have taken into account, there's some amazing papers. If you're interested, let me know and I'll tell you where to find them. The amazing thing about what these studies and the true concept of placebo is telling us is that it's not mind over matter, it's mindful matter. So it's not that this works because we're tricking ourselves, it's that all medicine works on placebo. And this is where the conceptual reality bias comes in, and really comes in powerfully, is this sense that even in things like schizophrenia, you will find that if you treat someone differently in a different culture who we in the West would say has schizophrenia. So if you treat them in a shamanic culture or even studies in China where they understand schizophrenia very differently, in Chinese medicine, the person who has schizophrenia has a very different experience. They don't suffer the same chronic issues, danger, life-threatening stuff that happens for schizophrenics in the West doesn't occur in Chinese medicine and in shamanic culture. And it's not that there's something wrong with Western medicine. It's just to say that cultural and perceptual biases are at the core of our experience. We're not trying to delegate what works and what doesn't into camps of good and bad, right and wrong, superior, inferior, ignorant, wise. It's not about that stuff, because all of that stuff is part of our conceptual and cognitive bias. All of what works, all of what's good, all of what's wise is part of the story that we're telling. And it's also mediated by what we allow ourselves to know. And that's part of our perceptual bias, which is a natural thing that all humans experience. It's inescapable. There's no way for you to say, oh, that's it, I'm going to learn how to not have a perceptual bias. It's impossible. But it is that self-awareness and that self-acceptance, as a whole, equal and essential being that has these things in place, that allows us to be in those spaces and simultaneously be conscious of the fact that this experience occurring right now is an example of, is a manifestation of perceptual bias. And it's a beautiful thing. And it allows us to realise that we don't have access to all the information. And that there's a liberation in that. And that, then we can come back to what we do have access to. Anyway, I think I went off the rails a bit there. So we don't have any direct perception. We can't have access to all the information. So, how can we know reality without a perceptual bias? We can't. These things are telling us. So what about other things? What about other things about the universe that we think we know? Things that we think are indisputable and universal. Just to take a breath when the phone goes over. Like gravity. Surely this is objective. Surely this is never changing. Actually, I think if you find there's a fantastic, well, it used to be on TEDx. I don't think it's there anymore, but I'm sure you can find it if you're looking for it. A Rupert Sheldrake video about the universal constants. I think it's called The Science Delusion. Anyway, he goes through a heap of things that are taken for granted within the science community. And I think he talks about medicine within that as well. And one of them is gravity. Gravity is not a constant. Actually, the measurements for gravity and a whole heap of other universal constants are averaged. So they're measured across the planet in different countries by the top scientists that care about those numbers, and then they're put into a pool, and they create an average, and they keep that average alive even though it doesn't exist. That's not the numbers. So even when we get to these points and you say, yeah, but surely this is true and objective, and this is the point that we can say we can operate from here, and if we stand in this place, we know all the people who are not standing on this place are deluded. And there's part of me that wants to say, and if that's true for you, it's true for a reason, and it's keeping you safe, giving you a sense of belonging and a meaningful life. But that's the cosmology, and we'll get into that later. But, even when I looked at all of these things, that I thought, well, surely these things are true, and there's measurements in place, and we can know the measurements outside of our own experience. It's not true either. So, what can we know? Once we've taken all that for granted, and it's a lot of information to take in and to keep in place, because when we go out into the world, we're not conscious of our cultural bias, we're not conscious of our perceptual bias, we're not conscious of our cognitive biases. They're not something at the fore of our attention. They're not something that's helping us mediate our experience. There's something that's operating invisibly. And when people start talking about these ideas, it's very tempting to then walk out into the world and try and try and overlay them. There's a temptation to use spiritual and scientific truths and overlay them over our perceptual bias and try to make sense of the world and ignore the invisible, which is fine. Carry on if that's what's happening for you. There's no sense of what you need to know. It's not like you have to go and study physics and you have to study consciousness and you have to study the universal constants and you have to understand all these things for yourself. It is more about, if you're here and you're listening to this, there's some pull, there's some sense of wanting to know, there's some openness to this story, to this information, to making visible whatever's carrying on to create your experience. There is, that sense of you want to know. You are the but why child that's going, well, I asked the questions and I got so many answers, but it didn't feel like I got the whole story. It feels like there's more information available. And so that's where, this whole exploration comes in. Okay, now more break, there's no time. And wherever this takes you is perfect. There is a sense that all the people that watch Rupert Sheldrake's The Science Delusion video go off into a million different worlds and investigations and senses of who they are and why they're here and what that means, and what it's not about saying we all need to end up in this one place, but what can we know? And there is, if you're still here, if you're still interested in this story, then this is where the story leads, leads, if you're still here. And the first one is about the heart. Now, in all of the investigations that have been done about consciousness and medicine, what we've come to understand, like when you study Norman Dewey, neuroplasticity and heart math, and you put all that information together, is that, and Philippe Golden, if you get a chance to have a look at any of those people, I just love all that stuff. Philippe Golden does a lot of mindfulness stuff. He went to India and studied, and then came back and did a PhD on mindfulness, and now he teaches, that those two things are not separate, the practice and the study. So what all of that information put together comes back to when we are about to make a decision, before we've even seen what's happening in the world, before the picture has been revealed, before we've opened our eyes to what's going on, or, what we're aware of, what we're capable of being aware of what's going on, our heart has a reaction. That reaction goes to a full brain awareness, not different parts of the brain. There is a full brain activation. It goes to the oldest parts of our neurological system, feeds into the neurosympathetic, into the systems of our body that take care of our breathing, sweating, all of that so-called emotional stuff, the nervous system that controls the manifestation of anxiety and excitement, all of those experiences that we're having that we've turned into cognitions, we've turned them into emotions and thoughts when really they're experiences. And then it goes into particular parts of the brain. So whether that's the amygdala, which is also connected to your emotions and your memory, how you remember things and store information, and how you respond to that information, how much you take in and how much you filter out. But the important thing to remember is that it happens in our heart first. And this is just the information that we can glean at the moment. There is a lot more going on. You know, there is a lot more to our experience than we can understand from a system that separates the body from whatever we think is outside the body. You know, if physics has already told us that everything is energy, hey, I'm going too fast. Anyway, so it happens in the heart first. And the next thing that feels, before we get to the energy thing, the next thing that feels important in what we can know is that all of our behaviour makes sense. All of the brutality, all of the uncertainty, all of the so-called stupid decisions, all of our behaviour makes sense. There is a way of understanding it. There is a place that you can stand that it makes sense. And it's not just your behaviour, it's anybody's behaviour makes sense. There is a place that we can stand that we can make sense of what someone is doing. And I know that's a crazy idea, but when you go down this rabbit hole, the only things that you can know are these three things. It starts in your heart, your behaviour makes sense, and everything is energy. So when I got carried away about the heart thing, everything is energy. I'm just feeling into what it is that helps you make sense of how these three things fit together. So when physics, biology looks at your body, they see that it doesn't end at the end of your skin. They know that everything is energy and the energy continues. And if you followed it all the way out, even just in a sense of who we are, not even at a quantum level, just in a sense of who we can know ourselves as and remain in our consciousness. If you followed it all the way out, you would find that there is no distinction between you, what you think is outside of you, the other people in your existence, you know, the objects, space itself, the other planets, the Earth. There is no line. Like, nobody can point to a boundary. So when we say we can see it happens in our heart first, there's a bigger story going on that we're just beginning to understand. And it's by putting it happens in our heart first, all behaviour makes sense, and everything is energy. It's in putting all that information together that we start to get a sense of what's actually going on. There's something integral about those three things that we can know that are really just one thing. You know, that they're not three separate studies. They're not three separate fields of study. They're three things that make our experience possible. And they make our experience possible and how to understand our concepts of identity in a new way, our concept of interrelation in a new way, And it feels like the beginning of that is it happens in our heart first, and that everything is energy, and energy is always moving. There is a sense that when you look at physics, it will tell you that you can't stop it, you can't control it, you can't make it stand still. It is everything. There's no sense that it's inside you, or it's moving through you, or it's happening around you. You are energy, and everything is energy, and there's no separation in that. There's no sense that it's good and bad. It's not positive and negative. There's no sense of it being divided into any sections. You know, there's physical energy over here and there's non-physical energy over here. It's all just energy. It all breaks down to just energy. And that it is this sense of, you know, it's always moving. There's some greater experience available for us in knowing that's true, in knowing that energy is always moving. Because a lot of the stories that we tell, you know, in the spiritual and scientific world are about cause and effect. I mean, even within medicine, it's that pathological story about cause and effect. And the coming back to, you know, it happens in the heart first. Medicine is mindful matter. Energy is always moving. These things begin to make our experience visible in a new way. And I think the beauty of heart alchemy is that it takes these ideas and makes this third, you know, the behaviour makes sense. Makes this third idea possible. You know, a lot of the spiritual and scientific information will tell you about it happens in the heart first and the energy is always moving, but it won't come back to behaviour makes sense. It will come back to we need to teach people, or we need to heal people, or we need to change people, or we need to fix something. You know, there's some other way of explaining, you know, or drawing a conclusion from the things that we can know, that it starts in the heart and the energy is always moving. And I think the beauty of heart alchemy is that it also takes into account that we are interconnected. That interconnection, oneness, whatever you want to call it, means that there's no polarities, there's no cause and effect, there's no judgment, there's no separation. Which is what I know. And there's something about defining it in the know that I'm not comfortable with. And yet, when I talk about interconnection, it doesn't seem to cascade out for people. There is a sense of what is invisible for them remains invisible. And when you're exploring heart alchemy, because it's not a conversion, you're not trying to drop something that's not true, you're not trying to change something that's wrong, you're not trying to fix something that's broken. Within heart alchemy, it is about that pull to a story that has those three parts in play, that it begins with the heart, that energy is always moving, and that behaviour makes sense. Where do I need to stand for those things to be self-evident? Really is what heart alchemy is about. And if we are inspired to create a planet where people are looked after, well, then we need to look after everybody. You know, and that sense of how do we look after everybody, knowing that it begins in the heart, that energy is always moving, and that behaviour makes sense. We can't make anyone wrong. We can't make anyone right. We can't say that people are learning. We can't say that people are teaching. And we can't say that, people are positive or negative or, evil and good and all of that stuff kind of doesn't make sense anymore. When you know that all there is the spectrum, that light and dark is just a spectrum. It's not in opposition. There's no sense of light being what we want and dark being what we don't want. If there is a sense of it all exists for a reason, and it doesn't exist so that we can have a war. It doesn't exist so that we can fight for more light. It exists because it's in harmony. Where do we need to stand to see that it's in harmony? Where do we need to stand in order to be with whatever someone's experience of reality is for them? What story are they telling? How can we understand the story that they're telling that keeps them safe, gives them a sense of belonging and a meaningful life? Because it's from that place that you get to live in unconditional love, that you get to have compassion. So the politicians' minds that you're trying to change, if you went in there like the tribe who sits around the person who's transgressed the rules, they sit around the individual and remind them of their divine identity. They remind them what's sacred about them. And in that reminding, that individual is, restored to an experience of their divine identity. It's not that anything transformed or changed. It was always there. But they weren't having an experience of that divine identity. They were having an experience of, a lack that needed to be filled, or a jealousy that needed to be righted, or, an injustice that needed to be fought against. So it's not so much that the person was healed, and you didn't teach them a lesson. You just reminded them about who they are. And if we could just remind everybody who they are, all of that other stuff that you want to be in play, the sustainability, the human rights, the heaven on earth, all of those things that you fight so hard for, if we could just focus on reminding people of what makes them sacred, all of that would be plain. And it's not that you remind people that they're sacred and then wait for the evidence that things are changing. Wait for the evidence and tick the boxes. Oh, look, I reminded 10 people of why they're sacred, and there's more money in my bank, or there's 3 children saved out of human slavery. It's not about counting and waiting and fixing and building, and it is about knowing that you're interconnected. It is about what makes me sacred, what makes you sacred, what makes them sacred. And if you're pulled to those places, the human suffering and the injustice, then it is still that those places are where you want to be reminding those people of their sacredness. And that's a big difference in focus. If you're moving in there with Heart Alchemy and you're saying, I can't see your sacredness right now, but I know that that's where I need to stand. If I really want to have an experience where the story tells me we are interconnected, that it begins with the heart, everything is energy, and that behaviour makes sense, then I need to move in there knowing that I have cultural and perceptual biases, knowing that right now I can't see where you're sacred, but I want to move into the place where I can. What do I need to do to move into the place where I can see that you're sacred? Because if I can see that you're sacred, maybe you can see that you're sacred too. And that's what Heart Alchemy is based on. It's based on the idea that I don't want to move into places and tell people where they're wrong. I don't want to move into places and tell people where they're better than or less than. I don't want to fix them. I don't want to, give them all this information and teach them about the world and make them see things from some particular perspective. I just want to be able to see where they're sacred, because if I can see it, then maybe they can see it too.